Hello everyone, Tatiana here. Welcome to the Intercultural Lab, which we mysteriously named DIE, or in Italian DIV, o DIV. So, che cosa facciamo oggi? What is our plan for today? Well, we will engage in an activity to learn some new concepts, to become more open to cultural difference, and to recognize the impact of culture on perception. Then we will have an activity in which you will have a chance to practice applying the new skills that you've just learned. And finally, you will be asked to answer some debriefing questions to process what you have learned and to have the opportunity to learn from it. So, cominciamo. Let's start. Take a look at the following picture. And in a few seconds, I am going to ask you to describe it. Here we go. All right, now here's your question 1. Please pause the video and then take about 2 minutes to describe what you saw. Write your answer directly in the discussion forum under question 1. What does the DIE actually stand for, you may wonder? It stands for description, interpretation, evaluation. Let's take a moment to think. How are they different? So in a nutshell, we may say that description is what we see. It might appear as more objective than the other two, but it still depends on what we notice or perceive, right? That would be description. Interpretation is what we think about what we see or experience, or we can define it as the meaning that we assign to what we see or what we notice. And finally, evaluation is how we feel about what we see or experience. It is sort of the value and the judgment that we assign to our interpretation. And it can be, we can see something as good, or bad, or neutral. So now that you know the difference between description, interpretation, and evaluation, think. When you were asked to describe the picture in the discussion board, what did you actually do? Did you just describe, or did you also interpret and evaluate? Please do not change anything you already wrote down. This is all part of the experience. If you interpreted and evaluated instead of simply describing, do not worry. Most of us did it the same way. Here are some examples from previous intercultural labs. And let's try to determine if they are description, interpretation, or evaluation. So some students said, she is refusing to get married. And we can tell that this is not purely a description because it's tainted with both interpretation and evaluation. So she is seeing marriage as something negative. It is some kind of exorcism. Again, not pure description. It also interprets what we saw and also has an implicit evaluation, probably something bad as exorcism. Some students said, people are outside. And that might be very descriptive, but also it has a note of interpretation in that we cannot be sure that they are really outside. It's a hypothesis. One woman is wearing white. Now this, of all these statements, might be the one that is truly descriptive. Because we see many women, but we singled out that one, and she was wearing white. Men are just standing there, not helping. All right, we did see men, right? And some of them were standing, but the whole statement is an interpretation and also has a note of evaluation because they're seen as doing something that they're not supposed to be doing, right? They're supposed to be helping and they're not. So my next question, why are they so hard to separate? Well, generally speaking, description, interpretation, and evaluation happen almost instantaneously in our heads and our bodies. Our brains are just wired to describe, interpret, and evaluate in an instant, and we have to work really hard to tease them apart. All right, let's try again. Take another look at the same picture, and this time, try only to describe. Now, pause the video and take about 2 minutes to write the description of what you saw. Write your answer directly in the discussion forum. So, how did you do this time? Was it easier to just describe now that you know the difference between description, interpretation, and evaluation? But even if we know the difference, it still seems really hard to come up with pure descriptions, doesn't it? Here are some examples of descriptions from previous intercultural labs. One woman is wearing white. We already saw this example. There are some men and some women. Also, seems like a good description because we can't be sure how many men, how many women. There are plenty of people in the background. Some women have hair coverings. One woman does not have a hair covering. So let's explore a little bit more in depth why these are so hard to separate. Well, a simple answer would be that it is innate. The fact that we instantaneously describe, interpret, and evaluate is an evolutionary trait essential to our survival as species. You may have heard of the fight or flight response. It is our ability to recognize danger and make a decision in a split second whether to fight it or flee it. This ability to conflate description, interpretation, and evaluation is thus super helpful in certain situations. Say a wild lion with a shaggy mane is starting to run at you. In this situation, your life depends on your ability to do the DIE in the split second. If you stop and then start first to describe the lion, interpret the action of the lion running towards you, and then evaluate it that it may be a dangerous situation, you would probably end up being eaten by this lion. Let's explore this quotation by the cognitive scientist Karsten Rous. She says, "Neural signals are related less to a stimulus per se than to its congruence with internal goals and predictions calculated on the basis of previous input to the system." Let's take a moment to think about it. What do you think this quotation means? How can we paraphrase it? Well, it may suggest that rather than seeing the reality as it really is, we see the reality as we really are. In other words, it may suggest that our perception is already tainted with interpretation, and that it is based on our internal goals and predictions. For example, I'm hungry and all I notice around me is food. Or that it is based on our previous experiences, and those previous experiences usually happen within a specific context, and that means a specific culture. So let's explore these questions. First, what does this have to do with culture? Well, Remember the lion and how doing the DIE instantaneously helped save our life? Well, there are some situations in which the fact that we instantaneously describe, interpret, and evaluate might actually also work against us. So, if I'm in a new culture and I'm relying on experiences from my own culture to interpret the new reality, or in other words, if I'm doing the DIE according to my own cultural rules, I may be just jumping to conclusions instead of describing, interpreting, and evaluating the new cultural reality appropriately. Here's one example. Someone winks at you. What factors into how you interpret and evaluate that wink? In some cultures, it may be a signal for you to leave the room, while in other cultures, it may be considered rude or disrespectful. And still in other cultures, winking may indicate a romantic or even sexual invitation. So, what we see or perceive, the winking, is the same, but how we interpret and evaluate that same description may vary considerably across cultures. And now, let's return to the photo that we just viewed. How do people from different cultures interpret and evaluate that photo? Can you draw connections between your cultural backgrounds and the ways you saw that picture? I would say that in interpreting and evaluating the photo, gender might be relevant. Women would probably identify with this picture differently than men. Also, in the era of the Me Too, some people from the US culture could maybe interpret the scene as gender violence of some sort, although it's actually the women who are holding the protagonist. Or maybe someone from a culture where women's hair must be covered can notice that the protagonist is not, and the other two women have the hair covering, so it might single out the protagonist in a white dress as an outcast. So let's look at this now. A similar way of thinking about DIE is a simple practice that we call plus-minus null activity. So when you see something, first determine what is your gut reaction interpretation of what is happening. The next step is to think, does that interpretation lead to positive, negative, or neutral evaluation? And the last step is to think about what are two plausible alternative interpretations with different evaluations. So, if your first idea, if your gut reaction was negative, can you think of neutral and the positive explanation of what is happening? And vice versa. So, plus, minus, null activity. Now, let's try to practice what we have learned. I'm going to show you a different picture. Look at that picture very carefully and then answer the following questions. I'll show you the picture first, then you will have time to view the questions and to pause the video and reply directly into the discussion forum. Here's the picture. Now, pause the video and take about 5 minutes to answer the questions on the following slide. Write your answers directly in the discussion forum. Question A. Describe what you saw. Be sure to separate description from interpretation and evaluation like we just learned. B. Now, move on to interpretation and evaluation. Make sure that you understand. Is your first reaction, your gut feeling, a positive, negative, or neutral evaluation of what you're seeing? And once you determine what it is, then follow through with plus minus neutral and come up with other possible interpretations of what you are seeing. Pause the video now and answer the questions directly in the discussion forum. All right. So now that you've experienced this activity, would you like to know the quote-unquote truth? Think about what insider cultural knowledge you would need in order to interpret these pictures accurately. And here is that insider knowledge that I'm going to share with you. So the first picture represents pizzica. Pizzica is similar to tarantella, a dance, an ancient dance that you may have heard about. And pizzica is a variation of tarantella that is specific to the Salento area in the region of Puglia. It's shrouded in myth and legend. This dance was thought to have been the only cure for a tarantula bite, or metaphorically for someone possessed by the devil. And metaphorically, that means for somebody who has a problem or some kind of emotional issue and is suffering. So whoever was bit by tarantula, metaphorically or otherwise, usually a woman, danced, and that dance continues for hours and for days until the main protagonist collapses to the floor, utterly exhausted, but hopefully cured. And oftentimes, family and other villagers would join in a show of solidarity. They would also accompany this dance with music, and they would actually be there for support. So, if you initially interpreted this image as something negative, and the presence of the men and the women as something that was sort of violent, we would be wrong, right? Because all of these people are there actually to support the protagonist. Now, the second picture represents the Orange Battle of the historical carnival of Ivrea in the north. During that time, during this carnival, the Ivrea community celebrates its right to decide for itself, commemorating an incident that is said to date back to medieval times. So for 3 days and 3 nights, 9 teams of orange throwers on foot, who are representing the rebellious townspeople, fight against the throwers on the horse-drawn carts who represent the forces of the evil baron. Now, real oranges and tons of them are being consumed during this orange battle of the historical carnival of Ivrea. Sometimes people get hurt, but it is a spectacle that keeps recurring every year and is, as you can see from the picture, also very, very popular. Now that you know the truth, my next question is it possible to come to different evaluations for one interpretation? Right? So now we not only describe these pictures, but also interpreted them according to their own cultural context. Now, is it possible to have different evaluations for one interpretation? And the simple answer is yes. It is entirely possible to assign an accurate meaning to what you experience in a new culture, but also to evaluate it differently than the locals do. The easiest way to understand this is to think about behaviors like kissing. A person from the US might interpret a kiss as a romantic gesture, while someone from another culture could see it just as a greeting. And even if they both agreed it was romantic, however, evaluations of the kiss might be very different depending on whether or not the kisser is attractive to the kissee, right? But in our case, even if we know that pizzica is a traditional dance valued by the locals, some people from other cultures may dismiss it as superstitious or backwards. And some other people may know that this Battaglia di Arance, so the Orange Battle of Ivrea, might be extremely wasteful, as any food fight actually is. Okay, so Now that we've experienced this activity and thought about it and wrote about it, the only thing that we have left to do is to talk about it. So these are your debrief questions about the experience of this activity. And I will just quickly read these questions. They're also posted on your discussion board. And so just please answer these questions. Question 1. What happened during the DIE activity? What was most difficult? What was easiest and why? Number 2. How did you feel when you were asked to describe without interpreting or evaluating? Number 3. How might personal or cultural values influence the interpretation or evaluation? Number 4. What did you learn? Number 5. How can you use what you learned in your everyday life? How can you use what you learned in Italian class or any language class or in a culture course, for example? That was all. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to reading your answers. Ciao.